So as you have seen throughout this section, when we work with backend services, we are dealing with observable objects. Now, earlier in the course, I told you that we use promises and observables to work with asynchronous operations. And if you have worked with other JavaScript libraries or frameworks, chances are you have worked a lot with promises. So you might be wondering why Angular team have used observables instead of promises. So in this lecture, I'm going to show you the difference between observables and promises. So to focus on one thing, I'm going to modify the code in the delete post method in our post component. Let's not worry about updating the user interface or error handling. So I'm going to delete all this code and simply call the server. So this, that service, that delete, and we give it post.id. Now let's see what happens if we don't subscribe to this observable. So save, back in the browser. I'm going to delete a post here. Now let's take a look at the network tab of Chrome Developer Tools. So here are the requests sent to the server. We have one request to get the list of all posts, but there is no request to delete that post. What I want you to pay attention to here is that with observables, nothing happens until you subscribe to them. In other words, if we simply call the delete method here, our service is not going to call our backend. This will only happen when we call the subscribe method. Let's try it. Save, back in the browser. I'm going to delete this post. Now let's take a look at the network tab. Okay, now we have a request for deleting this post. So you can see a delete request to this endpoint. So this is one of the key differences between observables and promises. Observables are lazy. In other words, nothing happens until you subscribe to them. Promises, on the other hand, are eager. So as soon as you create a promise, the code is executed. So let's go back to our data service. I'm going to change this delete method. And instead of returning an observable, I want to return a promise. So we can always convert observables to promises if we really want to, but this is something that I don't recommend you unless you have a strong reason to do so. So prefer to work with observables, as I will tell you later in this lecture. So here, just like we have the map operator, we have another operator for converting an observable to a promise. First, we need to go on the top and import this operator. So here, I'm going to duplicate this line and change the name of the operator to toPromise. Now back in the delete method, I'm going to add this operator here, .toPromise. Okay. Now back in our component, you can see we have a compilation error because promises don't have a subscribe method. So here we have only two methods. Then for getting the result and catch for handling errors. Now here, I'm not going to call then. So when we go back to the browser and delete a post, you will see an HTTP request to delete this post. Let's verify this. So delete. And in the network tab, you can see here we have a request for deleting this post. So promises are eager. We don't have to call the then method. Whereas observables are lazy. Nothing happens until we subscribe to them. Now you might be wondering why observables are lazy. The answer lies in the operators of observables. So back in our service, so far you have seen a few operators that are available on observables. There are lots of other operators for performing arithmetic operations, for working with timers, and so on. These operators are very powerful. They allow us to implement certain features with only one line of code. Let me show you one more operator. So instead of toPromise, I'm going to call retry. This is a very powerful operator. So if the call to the server fails, this observable will retry 3 times. Now, if you want to implement this feature in a traditional way, you know that as a minimum, you need a for loop. You need some variable to keep track of the failures. It's going to be at least 4 lines of code. Whereas here with this observable, all we have to do is to call the retry operator. There are lots of other operators. And these operators allow us to implement certain features with far less code. This is what we call reactive programming. So reactive extensions, or RxJS, which is the library where we get these observables and their operators, these allow us to write code in reactive style. So we simply create an observable and apply a bunch of operators, and then we will get some feature that is far more complex to implement the traditional way. Now, once again, this is an entirely separate topic. It's beyond the scope of Angular, and you don't really need to know that, because as an Angular developer, the two operators that you use most of the time are map and catch. Now, here is the key things I want you to take away. With observables, we have these powerful operators that do not exist on promises. And these operators only come in effect when we subscribe to an observable. That's why we can chain all these operators like map, retry, catch, and nothing happens. So when we call the map function, nothing is being mapped. All we are doing is programming this observable. So we can chain all these kind of operators, and later when we subscribe to these observables, all these operators come in effect. This is very powerful. So to wrap up, remember that you can always convert an observable to a promise, but prefer observables to promises because they're very powerful. They allow reactive programming. They provide a bunch of useful operators. And remember, observables are lazy, which means nothing happens until you subscribe to them.